if you start looking at the score to Final Quest, you start looking from the beginning at the moderato as we go through, there are 16th notes in just about every single beat of every single measure, with very few exceptions, all the way up to the andante. So it would be a really good idea to solidify the 16th notes in the style that you want right from the get-go before we start playing the piece, so that everybody's on the same page. This is going to make it sound a lot more clear. It's going to be a lot more stylized. It's going to solve a lot of tempo issues and phrasing issues that you might have if you're able to stage the technique and solve all this stuff before you even start rehearsing it. 16th notes are a pretty quick rhythmic value, and they require a lot of fine motor control in order to play clearly. If the students have a bad bow hold and they're not able to have flexibility in the wrist and the fingertips, it's going to be very difficult for an orchestra to play this well. So we got to make sure that everybody's playing with a good bow hold when we do all of these 16th note exercises. Now, as we stage, the first thing that we need to learn is how to hold the bow correctly, and we need to learn that flexibility in the wrist and then the fingertips. What I like to start with is just to have students hold up a pencil straight up and down, and I just like them to learn the bow motion with the wrist and with the fingertips, and isolate the wrist and isolate the fingertips. If you want, you can have them hold their forearm with the left hand so that they're just moving this instead of moving up and down like that, which is a common thing that you'll see a lot of students do, but it's not practical for this. So the first thing we need to do is get all the students start moving correctly with a pencil. Once they start getting comfortable with that, we can put it with a metronome and start at a slow tempo and see if they can do it in tempo, and then gradually increase the tempo until we get to quarter note equals 110, which is the written tempo for Final Quest. When you're watching your students do this exercise with a pencil, you need to make sure that they're using good bow holds, that they're using the right fine motor muscles to do this and not the larger muscle groups, because we want the fine motor control, not a lot of power here. And we need to make sure that the pencil is staying straight up and down and that it's not rotating off of its axis. Once the students start getting comfortable with this, and it might be a rehearsal, it might be 3 rehearsals, it might be a week of this, they can finally start adding the bow. Now, when the students add the bow, everybody has to agree on where these 16th notes are supposed to be played. And I think it works best to play this piece in the exact center, the dead center middle of the bow. If all of the students are in that spot, this piece is going to sound a lot better. It's going to be a lot clearer. We're going to have a lot fewer mistakes with tempo and phrasing. When the students switch from playing with a pencil to playing with a bow, there's going to be a difference in weight. The bow's going to be heavier than the pencil. And sometimes when they're dealing with a heavier object in their hand, what's going to happen is that they start to tense up more. We need to make sure that when we go from pencil to bow, that we keep the left hand, the fingers and the wrist nice and loose. Now, you can start with the bow straight up and down, just like with the pencils, and allow the hand to support the weight of the bow. Or you could put it right on an open string and just practice the bow motion that way. Okay, you'll have the students initiate the bow with the elbow this time, so they will be using the elbow to initiate the bowing, but primarily the wrist and the fingertips will be doing most of the action. So I'd have you set up all of your students on the D string, have them play open D, 16th notes in bowing lane 3 in the exact middle of the bow, and go around and watch and make sure that all the fundamentals are still in place. Good bow holds with curved pinky and thumb, that they're loose and relaxed, they're using their fine motor muscles, and they're just opening up the elbow to initiate the 16th notes and not doing it exclusively from the elbow or exclusively from the shoulder. If you have students that are compensating with the elbow or the shoulder, double check their bow holds again. A lot of times, you'll see this happening when they go from a pencil to the bow, because something gets lost in translation there, and you'll see the students have to relearn their bow hold when they're holding a different object. The other thing that you're going to see is your low strings are going to start to gravitate towards the lower half of the bow, and your upper strings are going to gravitate towards the upper half of the bow. And this is not good, because now we've got our low strings playing in the lower half and our upper strings playing in the upper half, and that's going to create a lot of confusion in the sound, and it could even create tempo and phrasing problems as well. So it's best to keep everybody in the middle of the bow. Now, why do the low strings tend to play everything in the lower half of the bow, and why do the high strings tend to play everything in the upper half of the bow? A lot of times it's because of that bow hold. If your low string section, they're extending that pinky and they're tensing up their pinky instead of just allowing it to relax over the camber of the bow, then it's going to tense up this part of the hand, and it's going to create flexibility issues within the wrist. And so what they're going to do is they're going to start compensating with the elbow and shoulder. And the easiest way to do that is to do that at the frog. And so they're going to start playing everything at the frog, where it's easier to use the elbow and shoulder. Unfortunately, it's not really the sound that we want, and it's also going to affect the tempo. You're probably going to, especially if they start pressing too much, you could probably guess that they're going to start dragging. Now, the opposite is true of violins and violas, who tend to play this in the upper half of the bow. And the reason for this is usually the thumb is straight instead of curved. And what that does is, again, the straight thumb creates tension in the wrist, and so they're not able to be flexible in the wrist to play the correct bowing style, and so they have to compensate with the elbow and the shoulder. And the easiest way for them to do this is in the upper half of the bow. So they're going to move out to the upper half of the bow and play this. And a lot of times this is going to make them rush. And so you got the upper strings rushing and the lower strings dragging, and you've got all this phasing going on in the piece. And plus, playing at the frog and playing at the tip, you're going to have different types of sounds, especially for younger players. Now, pros, you can play just as well at the tip as you can at the frog, but in this context, it's going to, the sections are going to be sounding different. They're not going to be blending as well. So once the students have mastered the bowing on an open string, now we can start adding the style, and we can start adding some phrasing, and we can start increasing the tempo. Okay, so we can go back to the beginning here, and we can have them start accenting the beats. 1E enda, 2E enda, 3E enda, 4E enda. We could start having them put a little bit of pressure on those beats and see if they can still keep their technique while applying a little bit of style. Okay, we can start doing some 4-bar phrasing. A lot of Final Quest is made up of 4-bar phrases. There's a lot of asymmetrical phrases, linking phrases, and all that kind of stuff too, but primarily we're working with 4-bar phrases here. So we can take 2 measures of crescendo and 2 measures of decrescendo, which is what they're likely to see in this piece when they're playing the 16th notes and they're phrasing through this. We also probably want to experiment playing these 16th notes on different strings, particularly the E strings and violins, have them play it on open E before we start to finger, to make sure that we're getting good E string sound and that we're able to retain our technique on the E string. We also probably want to check the lower strings, C string for cello, and even the E string for bass, just to make sure that they can grip enough to resonate the string and be flexible in the fingertips and wrists so that they can get a good sound. Okay, once we've mastered all of the right hand stuff, now we can start to add the left hand, but I like to stage this too. The first thing that I like to do is start with open D and do 4 16th notes of open D, and then do 4 16th notes of first finger E on the D string, and just go back and forth between D, E, 4 and 4, 4 and 4. Once we've mastered just the first finger, now we can start adding all of the other fingers, and we can work some of the finger patterns that are here in Final Quest with the 16th notes. So we can work on our intonation and our finger patterns, and we can also make sure that we can do it with a good bow technique. Now, to match what's happening here in Final Quest, like here in measure 11, for instance, we need to start moving from quadruples to duples. So we can have the students start playing finger patterns in groups of 2, up and down, and then eventually we'll be ready to start playing scales. Now, in measure 11, we have some type of G Dorian thing going on right here, and we can practice this slowly, and we can do it with the whole orchestra. We don't just have to have everybody play their part, and that will keep the cellos, it'll give them something to do, and the bass players would probably be bored if we just woodshedded 11, 11, 11 over and over again, and plus, they're going to need to learn the same technique. You don't want your bass section to not have the same technique as your first violin section. So it's good to pass this around, and so I'm going to create a PDF with all of these exercises you can download on teachingorchestra.com. But I really like to do this by rote as much as possible. And the reason for that is I like to have my students used to watching me. And so that when it comes to the tempo changes and stuff, they're already watching me. They already know what I'm going to give them and how to respond to my gestures and my baton. In measure 31, we have E flat Lydian here in the viola part right here. And we can practice it the same way that we practiced measure 11. Slow it down, have every student in the orchestra play the same thing. So now we have patterns that jump around. And so like in measure 14, for instance, we've got the second violins that jump around from the F to D, E to D, over and over again. And again, we practice these the same way. Now this is in third position. We don't have to do it in third position for everybody in the orchestra, but it does work out pretty nicely for most sections. But we can have everybody try it so that everybody learns the technique. Start slowly and then ramp it up as you go. Measure 26 is the same kind of idea, except now it's in the viola section. Okay, this works best in first position, but it's the same type of thing. We got the A to F, the G to F right here. And we just practice it slowly, make sure the technique is good, and once the technique is good, then we can bump up the tempo a little bit until we get it up to 110. In 83, the cellos get a turn to play some 16th note patterns here. And we have A to D, then E to D. So again, we can write this for everybody in the orchestra, practice it slowly, and then woodshed it for everybody. In measure 87, we have octaves in the second violin section. And interestingly enough, we have accents on the first two 16th notes, whereas before, we only ever see accents on the first one. And I believe the reason why is because Chisholm wanted the lower octaves and the upper octaves to be balanced. And that open A is a lot of times going to sound a lot louder than the fingered A on the E string. And so he writes the accents here to emphasize the upper notes. So when you woodshed this with the orchestra, you can have your other sections and even your first violin sections practice with harmonics, and that might be cool because they can practice harmonics and they can practice that shift, and you can also have them practice changing bowen lengths when they go from a harmonic to an open A. If you have an advanced low string section, or if you have any students in your low string sections that are advanced enough to do it, measure 46 works out really well when played in position rather than playing the open strings. It just sounds kind of remedial if the students are playing those open A's and getting the D's and the B flats in tune. Sometimes that doesn't always happen either. So if you look at this fingering that I have here, I've got the cellos playing D first finger, and then A third finger, fourth finger. So they have a string crossing here, but the tone just sounds a lot better, and the phrasing is going to be a lot better with the decrescendos. For the basses, I like to have them go across the strings rather than shifting all over the place. So D second finger, A second finger, B flat fourth finger. Okay. I like to have them practice that if you're going to do it that way. I like to have them practice it that way in 46 first, and then work on 42, 43. Reason being is that 42 and 43 is in a higher position than 46. So if they get more comfortable in 46, it's the same fingerings, it's just in a higher position at 42 and 43. Now, if you've got students that really need to remediate, you can have them go back and forth between octaves here. If they're more comfortable with the lower octave, you can have them play that at 46. Like, if you have a bass section that they're just not able to find those notes up there and it's just not sounding good, you can just have them play 42 again instead of 46, and it'll work out. But the fingerings are the same if you decide to have them play in position, and it makes it sound so much better. With this diminuendo that's happening 42, 43, if they're not just hammering these open Ds, and cellos and basses, it's going to be a much nicer phrase if you can pull it off. So this has been my set of practice strategies on how to establish 16th notes and then stage the technique until every student can play it accurately and within the right style. In the next video, we're going to start looking at the slurred 16th notes, which are going to be a lot different, and the emphasis is going to be mostly on the left hand here to make sure that we get that articulation. And we'll cover that in the next video.